So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this is a very important aspect of the 6-part series that we've been running with the Internet Archive, Library Futures, and DWeb on the decentralized web, which is a hot topic this season. So we're right on trend. So thank you for joining us for all our part of the series. This time we're talking about ethics. I think that's a key element that we should be discussing. So I'm very pleased that you've joined us today. My name is Davis Erin Anderson. I am Director of Programs and Partnerships at Metropolitan New York Library Council. We always love to have a robust conversation. So if you would like to drop your comments and your ideas and your questions into chat, we would love to see you collaborate that way. You can also use the Q&A feature if you want to pick a question to our presenters today. We would love to hear your cues. Please also note that we are governed by Metro's Code of Conduct. My colleague Mary Bakia is online as well, so she will drop the code into chat. Basically, we just ask for civility across all conversations here. So if we do that, we'll be in good shape. If you registered before around 10 a.m. today, you should have been in receipt of our 6 resource guide. We've been putting together a guide for all of our webinars, and this was the final one. We can drop a link into chat where you can find the first 5, and then you may have received the 6th one here. If not, we will drop a link into chat for you to peruse that there, and we'll also email it out to you following the session along with a survey, if you don't mind, please letting us know how you found this. It is my pleasure now to introduce you to Wendy Hanamura. Wendy has been our partner throughout this series, and it's been really a pleasure to work with you, Wendy, so thank you so much. It's been an honor. Wendy is Director of Partnerships at Internet Archive. She's been producing with us the 6-part series, Imagining a Better Online World, Exploring the Decentralized Web. And through her work with the community of DWeb, she's connected to the many experts she's brought to the series, including those we will hear from today. So thank you so much, Wendy, and over to you.
Davis, thank you so much. Welcome to our final session, the ethics of the decentralized web. I want to ask you, when you think of the ethics of the current web that we use, because let's face it, technology always embodies a set of values. What pops into your mind? What are the ethics, the values that you think drive our current web? Please write them in the chat. Share what you think. Nobody's writing. Well, I'm surprised because librarians like to talk about ethics and think about ethics, commerce, commodification, commerce, money, lack, wow, monetization, lack of privacy, user data. Here's an outlier. Brewster Kahle says, sharing what we know and selflessness, instant access. If those are the values embedded in our internet, in our web today, a lot of commerce, a lot of monetization, a certain lack of privacy, what are the values that you would like to see embodied in the web? Because believe it or not, we are creating a new web, a decentralized web, a new set of technologies that could one day be what we all use. Some people call it Web 3.0. We call it the decentralized web. What are the ethics, the values, the North Stars that should guide that? Community, collaboration, freedom, scholarly and political freedom. Let's build on each other's works. Sovereignty, democracy, trust. Well, if we have a web that embodies commerce, commodity, and monetization, and we want community and trust, how do we get from A to B? In many ways, that is what this session is about. I think first we have to name those values, name the ethics that we yearn for. So let me share with you the game plan for today. I've invited some of my deepest and dearest friends and allies to discuss this with you. We want to start by talking about DWeb principles. And I've invited Mai Ishikawa Sutton, who led a year-long process to define 5 principles of this community that we call the DWeb. Then we've asked Nathan Schneider, a scholar and author, to dive a little bit deeper. He's thought quite deeply about how we can embed and code certain values of human rights right into the blockchain themselves. And finally, we always wanted these sessions to be not just words, but also tools that you can use in your daily life. So we're going to end with Luandro Vieira, who's going to show you the tool Mapio, which is a peer-to-peer tool being used right now in Peru, in the Amazon, and beyond. I want to share with you this quote, though. It is by our speaker, Mai Ishikawa Sutton, who writes, "What matters in this discussion, in any discussion over technology really, is who's designing it, who controls it, and who stands to benefit." Who designs it, who controls it, who benefits? Well, when you think about a platform like Facebook, I think the answer is Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, and Meta. How do we get from that kind of consolidation of power, from profit-driven, highly consolidated, lightly regulated industry to a different paradigm? First, it seemed to this community that I belong to, the DWeb community, that it would be helpful to have a few North Stars to work from. So I asked two people from very different backgrounds, John Connor Ryan, who comes straight from Silicon Valley. He has a PhD in many things. He's an engineer. And I also asked Mai Ishikawa Sutton, who's about to speak to you today. Mai began her career at EFF doing international policy around IP, intellectual property. She often represented libraries. She worked at the Oakland Public Library for a year and a half. She's a writer. You'll see many of her articles in our resource guide. And right now she is the founder and editor of a very new publication called Compost Magazine, which is an experiment that you can read right on the decentralized web. But back in 2019, she engaged people all over the world in a discussion about what are the principles we want to hold dear. So with that, I want to turn it over to Mai Ishikawa Sutton.
Hi, Wendy, and thank you for that introduction, and great to be here today. So yeah, I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about the process that led to these principles and then share the principles themselves. So since 2016, the Internet Archive has been putting together these virtual and in-person convenings to bring together people who are dreaming and building the webs of the future, a web that comes after the web that we have today, which we criticize as being centralized, and all of the values that you all have put in the chat, these negative values, honestly, that don't empower people, don't give people agency and the control that we think we should have over our means of communication and the means in which we share culture and knowledge and everything else with each other. And so this photo is a picture from DWeb Camp 2019, where we came together with hundreds of people at this mushroom farm near Pescadero, California. And people just brought their whole selves to think about what it is to build this new set of webs of the future. And what became clear was that it's not just about the technology. Of course, the technology comes out of us. As we build something, we embed our belief systems and our values and our ideas about what it is that we think should be useful for ourselves, but then of course for other people. And I think a major problem with the web that we have today is that there's a lot of assumptions being made about the kinds of people that they think should be using it, the ways that they should be making money off of it and sustaining the project. And this event, DWeb Camp, really brought together these people, and we had a lot in common in terms of what we felt like, what it is we stood for, not just what we stood against. After DWeb Camp 2019, throughout 2019, 2020, my co-steward and I, John, we went through a process of developing a document. It sounds funny maybe to come up with some like centralizing, unifying document to reflect a value of something that's called decentralized, but I think we're very clear as we went through this process that this is a reflection of this particular community. And it was a way for us to draw a line in the sand and say, hey, you can be part of this group of people who are having these constructive, I believe, conversations about the values that we want to embed in the web. If you don't believe in it, if you think that, just having it be profit motivated, that you think that one technological tool should be used by everybody in the world, that maybe you don't belong on this side of the sand, of the line in the sand. So really it was an effort to kind of tap into the brain trust of all of these people that we've started to connect with through the DWeb events and come up with a document. And so John and I came up with a document that we felt reflected it as much as possible. And then we just let everybody that we invited, and we we talked about it publicly at our DWeb events for them to input and sort of just shape it as a community together. And so this is the document that you'll be seeing now, which I'll say is version 1.0. We don't think that principles should be the static document. Beliefs about how we be better together, how we do better with our tools and our technologies are going to be evolving. And so we didn't want this to be static, but we felt like this was a really good point to kind of capture what it was we believed in at that point. So we have 5 overarching themes that our principles fall under. The first one is technology for human agency. And I'm not going to read all of them, but you'll notice that this is, talking about the technology, not just the organizational, social aspect of it, which you'll notice the rest of the document is very much about the humans. It's about how we treat each other, how we relate to each other. And so, we, for instance, we urge coexistence and interoperability and discourage walled gardens. We value open source code as a fundamental building block of an open and inclusive web. And then I really love this last one too. We believe that multiple technical means will be more effective than a single technical solution to achieve ethical and people-centric outcomes. And so that's to really emphasize that if we want to build a decentralized web, we need to encourage a multitude of solutions to address a multitude of cultures and communities and problems that we're facing as humans. The next one is distributed benefits. And this one really addresses the ways in which the web and the web platforms of today extract our data for profit and extract our attention. It's very much about not sharing the benefits of it, both monetary and the social benefits. And so we wanted to emphasize that it's really also a question of power. So it's about benefits not being, tapping into what is sort of cultivated and taken and harnessed from all the powerful tools that are being built. That should flow back to people who are using it. It shouldn't be going to somebody else, which is exactly what's happening with Facebook and Amazon. It's going into the pockets of, Bezos and Zuckerberg and all those people. And so this is kind of speaking to some of these efforts that are around community networks and social enterprises like cooperatives and platform cooperatives, which is this idea that our platforms should be owned by either the users and the workers, or just the workers and the builders of that tool. For instance, in New York City, there's a taxi cooperative called Drivers Cooperative. There are several of these platforms that the developers and the users are controlling it themselves, and they then get the profit back. And so this one is speaking to that. And then mutual respect. I mean, if you've been on the internet at all, you'll notice that there isn't a lot of respect on many of these centralized platforms. And so we really wanted to kind of point to what that might look like. First one that we wanted to outline is the fact that clear codes of conduct is really important to make sure that the people who are in a space understand what it is how they need to behave, that there's a baseline for how we should be communicating with each other so people feel safe and people can speak however they want to on the platforms that they're using. And then out of that, for people to be mindful and take responsibility for their speech and behavior. Wouldn't that be amazing if we had that on the platforms that we spend our time on online? And then the final point of this was that we wanted to make sure that the organizational practices themselves, the motivations and the governance reflected this idea of mutual respect. And this came out of this idea that the organizations that are managing our network tools are, our social media platforms, our internet service providers, that they themselves should be holding up clear codes of conduct, treating their people well, and that reflects into the tools that they build. And so that third point is reflecting that as well. So our fourth one is empower people. And I really wanted to emphasize the human rights aspect of the decentralized web, that we wanted to make sure that human rights were protected, that it would empower people, and particularly people who experience systemic inequity and prejudice. We wanted to explicitly condemn the use of distributed tools that, unfortunately, in some parts of the dark web are used for human trafficking, used for really problematic purposes. And that, if you are part of this DWeb community, we're not standing for that. You can say that a decentralized web should enable anyone to do anything. Some people might say that, but we're not saying that. We're saying, no, you have to be standing for these positive rights, these human rights, that you are not using these tools for ill purposes, and you're not building them that in ways as much as possible that can be mispurposed for terrible purposes. There was a little bit of controversy over that one, but we wanted to make sure that was very clear. And maybe I'll highlight one more. So number 5, we encourage the development of tools and applications in many languages and forms with a high degree of accessibility. This is speaking to the fact that largely the web is in English. It's also not conducive for people who have disabilities. And we really wanted to ensure that that is a large part of the ways in which we are building a more inclusive, just web through decentralized means. Ecological imperatives. So this one I will personally admit is the weakest one. It's ecological awareness. What does awareness mean? You're not proactively protecting, the planet that we live on. And so actually, well, I'll talk about these two because it's short, but that we wanted to ensure that projects minimize ecological harm and avoid technologies that worsen environmental health. You've probably heard of some of the ways in which blockchain technologies are really burning a lot of energy. So we wanted to point to the fact that that is not okay. And we really need to move away from those means in which it's using massive amounts of carbon. And then finally, that we think that thinking about the hardware, we don't think about these networks using, the computers that we use, the routers, the servers, the undersea cables, all of these things. There's actual concrete systems that enable these networks to exist. We wanted to make sure that we aren't creating more waste as much as possible through the hardware that we're using. We wanted to highlight the fact that the principles that we made stand alongside these other principles. This is just some of them that we wanted to highlight. Some of these are really amazing, have gotten a lot of energy put into them. So please check those out as well. So what's next? As I said, that last one, ecological awareness, is not the strongest language. And so at DWeb Camp this summer, we're going to be revisiting that and strengthening that language around how we are proactively thinking about decentralized tools and the ways that we relate to the planet. And I think this photo is from a parade that we had at the end of DWeb Camp 2019. I think really thinking about our future is really crucial in defining the web that we want. All right, I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Mai. So Mai, it seems to me that there's never been a more polarized time when you think about what we do and the decentralized web. If you say Web3 to certain people, they just go ballistic, right? They think of scams and NFTs and duplicitous behavior. How do you distinguish that Web 3.0 from the decentralized web?
I feel like I've been following this debate or conversation the last several years, I think, since it started to emerge. And I think Web 3.0 versus DWeb, it's kind of like a self-label for people. For me, Web 3.0 really speaks to those who are building decentralized tools in such a way in which it's kind of for profit. It's kind of a signal like, we're not Web 2.0, we're Web 3.0. So we're the next evolution in this process of technology. And so it's really focused on these like technological aspects of decentralization instead of actually addressing, sort of these fundamental issues of power and control and capital, right? And so what I really like about the DWeb, and I would say our DWeb space is kind of the loudest voice in now saying, this is what DWeb is and defining it. That we're constantly, in dialogue with what it is we're decentralizing. It's not this static term. It's a verb. It's also talking about like it's sort of gets at like the heart of it. We're decentralizing power and we're decentralizing the means in which things are being managed technologically. And so I wrote a piece on this. I think it's in the guide as well. So I kind of go into the distinctions a bit more.
Jeffrey would like to know, okay, these are big concepts. So can you give me examples of humane design for non-users, non-technologists?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you'll hear from Luandro about his project, but I'll name a few. So one of our fellows from DWeb Camp 2019, she is part of a nonprofit in South Africa that builds cooperatives that build community networks in post-apartheid South Africa. And so that nonprofit is enabling the people of that community to own the antennas that are on their houses, and they have local servers that have local knowledge. During the pandemic, she gave a talk, and she was talking about how, the government was saying, wash your hands every time you go somewhere, wash your hands as much as possible. But in these contexts, a lot of people don't have running water in their home. And so they had to translate that information and say, we have the shared tap in our community. How are we going to make sure that we're not exposing each other and staying safe and all that? And so in that example, it's the people who are controlling their own technology, that are building their own means of how they're sharing information and making sense of that. And it's not getting extracted to some, Amazon or Facebook. And that type of, I think, example where it's not just that they're building the technology, but it's also fulfills the principle in distributed benefits. It's a cooperative. And so when they pay into and own this technology, the benefits are flowing back into the community.
Thank you, Maya. And I want everyone to go and look at Compost Magazine, which is also a distributed benefit cooperative operation. It's not a co-op, but it works very collaboratively. Thank you.
Yeah, and some of the articles too highlight examples of ways in which these principles are being practiced. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Nathan Schneider, and he is an expert in decentralized governance. He's a professor, he's an author. He teaches at the University of Colorado, where he leads a group called the Media Enterprise Design Lab. Nathan has also edited a book that comes out in September by Vitalik Buterin called Proof of Stake, The Making of Ethereum and the Philosophy of Blockchains. He's here, though, to talk about the possibility that human rights can actually be encoded right into the blockchain. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. First of all, following Maya and guided by Wendy, people I admire tremendously. And also among librarians, I have the privilege of living in a household with a partner who's in library school right now and is just loving every minute of it. And I get to learn through her what the kinds of things that are coming up in that world and the challenges. So I'm really grateful to be here, and I hope this is useful. I want to share some reflections on what a crypto economy landscape protocol universe might look like that's actually worth having. We've seen, as Wendy and Maya suggested, a lot of really dark stuff happening in crypto. At the same time, in the years that I've been involved in it, I've seen a lot of exciting things, things that give me some hope. And I want to construct a kind of world based on some of those examples about what these systems would really need to have in order to be up there with libraries as being true civic institutions. I'm going to begin with a brief subjective history of crypto, which derives from my experience with this world from when I first got involved as a reporter in early 2014, when the Ethereum project, now the world's second most valuable blockchain, was just an initial proposal. And I was a reporter living in New York at the time and following the early development of this. At that time, it seemed like it was a bunch of nerds and techies and so forth, gobbling up weird monetary theory. This Bitcoin thing had showed up, and They were, reading Hayek and trying to understand what the nature of money is to better design systems around money. And it was, to me, kind of icky. I'm not really a money person. Money to me is a thing that you use to do something else. And there was a lot of kind of deep obsessiveness about money as the solution to everything. Then with Ethereum particularly, the idea of programmable systems or protocols that you could program, that you could write organizations into. You saw a lot of experimentation with weird financial derivatives. At the time, I was kind of interested in, could this produce democratic experiments? But a lot of what people were doing was like coming up with ways of reinventing, potentially illegal forms of financial stuff. Not very interesting to me. Now, we're seeing more and more a maturing of the stuff that actually first got me interested in this whole area, which is governance, the possibility of experimenting with the future of how we self-govern, using these programmable systems to program in possibilities that we don't have in our ordinary economic and civic lives, and see how they go, and learn from those experiments. And for better or worse, the kind of intensity and volatility of the market in crypto these days has really surfaced the need among a lot of people involved in it to get really serious about how we govern this thing. A lot of efforts to imagine that we could not govern these tools, that they would somehow govern themselves, have kind of run aground. And this is the space. My last book was on cooperatives. A lot of my work has been on, solidarity economy stuff. But I see creativity here in the crypto world, actually, in little corners of it that you don't see in a lot of those other spaces. And there's, and something really important is underway. And it's that I want to build on. At the same time, the dangers are very real. I remember when Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, his book I have been editing, first announced the project Ethereum at Bitcoin Miami in 2014. He described all the wonderful things that could be done on a programmable blockchain, and ended with Skynet, and then did a mic drop and walked away. Skynet is the computer system in the Terminator movies that takes over, tries to exterminate the human race. And already we're seeing respects in which these tools are producing what the economists call externalities that are kind of troubling. The carbon emissions from the mining rigs that run Bitcoin and a lot of these other blockchains, the incursion of corporate power and money and control in these systems. And then, we just seem a few steps away from some really dangerous outcomes, like, for instance, smart contract powered roving bands of bounty funded mercenaries and killer drones. Kind of a joke, but kind of not. With Web 2, so to speak, things like Facebook and Twitter and so forth, the system has matured to the point where we see some really, really troubling abuses of human rights being facilitated on these tools, from the massacre of Rohingya people to the degradation of democratic systems in many places. And I think there's every reason to imagine that even more serious harms are possible through this Web3, through crypto, because of the way in which it attaches not just communication to the networks, but also money. At the same time, this stuff does enable the possibility of a new opportunity to achieve economic democracy and pluriverses for all. It all depends on how you program these systems. They're protocols. It depends on how you write them. It depends on what you tell them to do. And in these things, I think there is actually an opportunity to achieve some of the stuff that governments have really failed to do around human rights, ensuring a healthy climate, global solidarity across borders, and achieve enforcement against bad actors that, in many cases, governments have failed to enable, often because they're the bad actors themselves. What if these kinds of protocols could enable forms of enforcement through their programming, through their design, to actually ensure protections that we don't have yet, that we've claimed we need, that have been aspired toward but have not been achieved, as well as ones that we haven't quite conceived of yet. And this is a really live question because jurisdictions are already in the making with these tools. Whether we like it or not, blockchains are creating a kind of government, a new kind of economic system that has its own semi-autonomous forms of governance that is becoming very real and that is affecting economic flows around the world. This conflict in Ukraine, for instance, has showed both in the context of Russia and Ukraine how crypto has enabled economic flows that the normal system might not. And also just some of the developments happening in the crypto world now, particularly, for instance, how Ethereum is evolving. We're seeing a kind of new wave of jurisdictions forming in which people are governing in ways that don't really map onto old world governments or territories, but that really enable new sites of digital, virtual, transnational co-governance. And so I'm really interested in what are those jurisdictions going to do? What are they going to be for? I'm going to introduce a few examples of policies that we might try to imagine, that we might try to build into these systems. So far, a lot of what crypto has been designed for is a kind of narrow set of goals and a narrow set of rights, if you think about it in terms of like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For instance, these systems are incredibly hardened to protect property, which is one of those universal rights, according to the UN. If you have control of your system, or of your address, your private key, it's yours. Similarly with censorship resistance, it's with some of these tools, it's very hard for some third-party actor or even central gatekeeper to prevent you from doing or saying something on it. But you don't see a whole lot of other kinds of rights built in, rights that I think we really need, particularly as this ecosystem evolves. And it really matters what we write into these protocols now, as early as possible. I follow in this the journalist and scholar Rebecca McKinnon, who wrote eloquently about human rights abuses in Web 2 and has warned people building new decentralized technologies that it's never too early to get serious about the potential for human rights abuses, because often these things arise when the systems have already been kind of baked in, and it can be too late. If code is law, what kind of law in that code do we want and need? So one example is, people talk a lot about decentralization in this world. What if the protocols were designed to actually ensure that much more resolutely, particularly decentralization of power and wealth? What if the protocols were designed to automatically redistribute wealth and power when it starts getting too concentrated? We don't have systems that do that, but actually the Securities and Exchange Commission has provided a kind of external version of this by giving a kind of leash to blockchain projects that are what they call sufficiently decentralized. And that way they don't have to file for SEC approval and this sort of thing. What if we built that kind of expectation into the protocols themselves? Already that legal expectation has shifted behavior among designers in, I think, largely good ways. What if these were more hard-coded into the tools themselves? So if we're not just talking about decentralization, but it's actually built in. Now, transparency. These tools are really built for transparency. They're especially public blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum, so much is visible. But at the same time, in a lot of the communities and projects and companies built on these tools, a lot of the most important stuff is not on display. And we could imagine systems that are much more rigorous about expecting transparency in how governance processes work, how decisions are made, what kind of assets and human activities lie behind the chain. We have the possibility with this technology of actually transparency of a kind that we don't have with a stock exchange, for instance, and that we could have to much greater degree if the protocols were much more demanding about what they display, not just your transactions, but actually much more that enable us to evaluate, how real are the claims that a given project is making? Is that stablecoin really backed by all the assets that people say it is? Another thing that I come to, through my work in the cooperative movement is this idea of labor over capital. In cooperatives, we talk about labor renting capital rather than capital renting labor. And this is something that some blockchain protocols have actually been exploring, is treating labor participation as different from capital participation, ensuring, for instance, that developers who are contributing to code might have special power over that code that investors whose interest is purely financial don't have. So those developers are really stewards of the protocol. And similarly, you can imagine things like what I see happen in the cooperative world quite often, like ensuring that, okay, people can invest and buy tokens, but those investment tokens are treated differently from the tokens paid out to people who do work. And to ensure that labor has rights in this new economy that it really hasn't had in the economy of the kind of normal world outside of it. One thing that we're seeing a lot of interest in, a lot of recognition is, it's sort of obvious to the rest of us, but in crypto land, it took a few years for people to figure out that business alone does not produce all the things that you want in a decent economy. And so people in these worlds have been starting to explore the recognition that they need a kind of taxation, that systems need to be set up to pay for public goods. And so they're trying a bunch of different experiments and what that looks like. Librarians are going to be very familiar with the need for public funding for public goods. And people in this ecosystem are now just beginning to design, how should we derive that funding? Does it make sense to do something equivalent to an income or wealth tax? Should it be taxation on new tokens being introduced into a system? Should payments be made to projects that have already showed promise, as opposed to proposals that show promise for future projects? These kinds of questions are very much in play. And it's in some ways, a really exciting opportunity to rethink how we fund public goods. In my community, my partner who I mentioned earlier is involved in an effort to move to a library district. That's one example of a shift in how public goods are funded. But with these tools, we can really start from scratch and reimagine how we fund our public goods. Reparations are a really important component of this. Already we're seeing that those who already have wealth in the external economy have special access to this emerging economy. How do we make sure that this one is designed differently so that people who are undercapitalized are the ones that we're really designing a financial system around? This is something that I think has been a tremendous oversight in the development of blockchains so far, that have been designed so much around the model of like the individual gambler, somebody who's coming with money and wants to play around with finance. I think we need to design systems that are first built around enabling people to access capital to do valuable things, especially those who don't already have capital. And recognizing that we live in a world of unequal access and power, and ensure that we're building these new systems around a different kind of approach. Again, I think there are a lot of really interesting models from the cooperative world about how to ensure that capital flows toward undercapitalized people, toward valid projects, and that you're not building in assumptions like so much of our financial system that worthy projects are going to come from wealthy people. We talked already a little bit about the role of carbon emissions in this economy. We're starting to see protocols that are designed to be carbon neutral or close to zero carbon. This could actually be written into a protocol. So for instance, if somebody were mining for coins on this protocol on a given blockchain, there might be a system where if somebody demonstrates that miner, that participant in the network is actually taking advantage of a coal power plant, that they would be removed from the network. That could be written into the code to ensure that these systems are demonstrably carbon-free. And other ways of incorporating that principle of global awareness, however we develop it at DWeb Camp this summer, that Mai talked about earlier. This is we can write some of these principles, these goals around an ecological integration right into the code of how these things work. And there's a much wider picture of what we could imagine. I think, for instance, of Isaac Asimov's, principles around around what robots should not be allowed to do, these kind of laws for robots, about not harming human beings, for instance. Maybe blockchains should automatically stop smart contracts that can be demonstrated to be hurting a human being. There's a wide range of things, of ways in which we could begin implementing the kinds of goals about a humane and worthwhile society that we might have into the systems that we're building now. And again, I think there is an opportunity not just to catch up to institutions as we've known them, but to actually advance on them and to ensure that these new technologies give us a chance to actually build a more humane world, not a less humane world. But in order to do that, I think it's so important to recognize that so much of what we would need to have a world of sufficient human rights is not being written into these systems right now. That it's been set aside and actually not even considered among many of the people building these tools. And actually, I think that's a missed opportunity, not just from the perspective of humanitarian concern, but also from the perspective of design. Justice and democracy are a powerful palette. They enable possibilities for creative and life-giving systems. And I hope designers building these tools can begin to recognize that more and to see these goals of justice and democracy as also raw material with which to build. Thank you.
Nathan, thank you so much. I'm afraid we don't have time for questions, but there are a lot of really good questions in the chat. And I'm wondering if you would take a moment to answer them in text. And Nathan will also be coming to DWeb Camp. So if you want to ask him over breakfast, you can come too. Next, it is my deep pleasure to introduce to you Luandro Vieira. Luandro, every time I call him, he's in some different spot. But what I love most is when he's in his village in Brazil. He lives in a village that is mostly offline. There's 3 villages. Only one of them is connected to the internet. So he's always talking to me via like some Raspberry Pi gizmo that he's linked up. And he does the most interesting work. He has worked, of course, with traditional communities in his own native Brazil, but now he is working in Peru, in the Amazon, as a designer and digital activist with Digital Democracy, one of the best humanitarian technology companies in the world, bar none, one of the most ethical. He is here today to demonstrate a tool that they devised called Mapeo. So I'm going to turn it over to my friend, my colleague, Luandro Vieira.
Thank you, Wendy. I hope you can hear me okay. Audio is coming from my phone and video from my computer having some hardware problems. Let's talk a bit about Mapeo, which is a tool we developed in digital democracy. But the most important thing about it is that it's built with the communities and for the communities. And I think that's very important. Uh, one of our biggest challenges is to make our partners' voices be heard, so that the tool that we are developing, has as much of their needs expressed as possible. Here are some values that are very aligned to the values that might share with us in the beginning, so that the data is owned by the community. Also call it data sovereignty. That the application is co-designed with the communities, that it works offline, but because not everybody has access to the internet, and they shouldn't have if they don't want to. It's optional, and it should be translatable, as saying that should be accessible, and very importantly, easy to use interface. We also have to understand that not everybody knows how to read and write, and they also shouldn't know how to read and write. It's also optional. So we should respect communities that are orality first. And these are some of the tools that I've personally worked with. Earth Defenders Toolkit is also something we are co-designing within digital democracy, and it's an effort to kind of to aggregate all these tools and document them and present use cases for communities. So Aho is an example, LibreRouter, which is for community networks, and Mapeo, which is what we'll be talking about today. So Mapeo, what is it? It's a mobile and desktop application that provides free and accessible geospatial technology. It was built for Earth Defenders to easily document environmental and human rights information and to collect data about their land. So, who are Earth Defenders? We understand as Earth Defenders the people who are right at the front lines of defending the forests that are left in the world. So, we work a lot with indigenous communities all around the world, and they're usually very marginalized and kept afar and don't have access to technology. So we work together with them to empower them to in their autonomy and their fights. So what makes Mapeo different from other mapping tools is that it's very customizable. So all the categories you can customize according to community needs, and both the icons and the names. Sometimes the icons are even more important because people might not know how to read, so it's important that people understand what the icons mean and what they are mapping. So this is an example of a map that can be built with Mapeo. This is a very complex map by the Guarani people in Ecuador, and yeah, it's very detailed. There's actually an online version of it that, as the more you zoom in, the more details it has, just to show how many points they have collected, thousands. These are some of the places that we are working with partners with Mapeo. There are probably a lot more that we don't know of that are using it by themselves. So it's Mapeo is mainly used by indigenous peoples around at least 16 countries in Latin America, Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. Also, we know we have partners in North America and other parts of the world. It has been used mainly to map and monitor threats from invasions, mining, logging, oil activities. So very sensitive data. That's why the community owning the data is so important, and that's where decentralized web is very important here, because if you just have a centralized server, that is very easy to be hacked. And obviously, if you have a centralized server in the internet, it's not going to be community owned, so a lot of risks. And yeah, this is just one example of how Mapeo was used by the Guarani people of Ecuador. So they, with assistance of Mapeo, they were able to win a court case to protect their territory. So 500,000 acres in the Amazon were protected because of it. And now, very quickly, I would also like to share Mapeo, the app itself, so you can see how it works. So this is Mapeo. So as you can see, this is a map that it would work offline. This map has a lot of details. This is specifically to some communities in Peru, where to their map we added all the information about the oil activities going on their territory. And these are all the points that have been mapped. This is not the communities itself, the points that they took, because it could be very sensitive. It's just some maps that our team took. So as you can see, the interface is very simple. It's basically, you can create a point. You select what is the point you wanna take. So for example, this is all in Spanish, has been translated. Some stuff it can be translated inclusive to indigenous languages. So you just select one and add information, and you have even forms that you can create. This is also very customizable. You can create the questions you want, any questions you want. You can add photos as well to the observation, and finally create it. So here, and you have a list of observations that you took. So here, for example, is one, the point, and with all the pictures, botadero, which is garbage, basically, and all the questions that have been answered about it. And what makes Mapeo special in the use of decentralized technologies is this button over here. This is for syncing. Unfortunately, I don't have another device. But if I had another device on the same Wi-Fi, it would appear here, and we would be able to sync all our data. And down here, you have a key which makes it safe. So I'd only sync with a device that has the same key. So no external actor could come and synchronize and get the data from the community. And yeah, this is basically it. This is a basic demo of Mapeo. Hope you all enjoyed it.
Thank you, Luandro. I think what's so unique, sorry, I'm having trouble turning on my camera. There we go. That people may not get is that the people who are using this in the Amazon, obviously they do not have internet connection in the Amazon. And they're trying to build this collective map with assets and tie it to a place that's geolocated. And they're doing that all without the internet. That Mapeo is a peer-to-peer technology that lets you to collaborate. And because it's peer-to-peer, you can also determine who saves that data. You were saying that it's very important because in this case that the Guarani were waging, they could have gotten killed for some of the data that they were trying to preserve. There were big forces against them. There's a question for you, Luandro. How is data protected after it's shared? What if someone tries to falsify it or modify it?
Yeah, that's actually, Mapeo is built on Hypercore, and it's also uses some principles from Scuttlebutt in it. So it's a append-only log, similar to the blockchain, how it works, right? So it can't be altered. Once you put data in there, cryptography guarantees that data can't be manipulated. So yeah, that's why it's so important. That is very important for court cases, for example. You can have data, and you know that that data hasn't been tampered with.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Luandro. And you too will be at DWeb Camp, so people can come and try this. And there's links and articles that you've written in our resource guide. Thank you so much for being with us. I think you're in Berlin and it's about 1 a.m. or very, very late. So we really appreciate you showing us Mapeo and all the work that you and Digital Democracy do. I wanted to go back to our deck and just remind you that we keep talking about this incredible resource guide where you can find articles by Mai and by Nathan and by Luandro. Well, it is there for you. It will be sent to you if you register for this. It's in the Internet Archive, and you can find it on the getdweb.net site, the Metro site, and the Internet Archive site. And finally, we keep talking about this event that's coming up in August 24th to 28th. I want to invite each and every one of you. You do not have to be a technologist. You just have to be interested in building a better web, a decentralized web with people who want to embed the right ethics, the right tools. They want to encode our values right into the blockchain. Nathan, Mai, Brewster, me, Luandro, we will all be there, and we hope you will be there with us too. This is the very final of 6 Metro seminars on the decentralized web. Thank you so much for being with us. It felt like a little bit of a marathon to me, but I hope that you have enjoyed it and have learned a lot. The videos exist of everyone. There's a blog for everyone, and there is a resource guide for everyone, all licensed under Creative Commons. So please share them with your students, with your faculty, with your communities. We wanted to help everyone find their place in the decentralized web. That was our goal. So thank you so much. And until we meet again, perhaps in the forests of Navarro, I'm Wendy Hanamura, and thank you for joining us.